All right, so we're going to continue on today in the book of 1 Samuel. I believe we're in chapter 14, and we made it to verse 24 last time. We were talking about the battle between the Israelites and the Philistines, and how this was kind of like this was a big landmark moment that really said, no, we're no longer going to be oppressed. We are going to be a free people. We are going to live under the rule of God, right? This is where things are beginning to change. But it's also where we begin to see the failure of Saul. Significantly, the failure of Saul. And we're going to see it. It's just, the failure of Saul is a lot like compound interest. It just gets worse with time. And you're going to see this. And a lot of this has to do with ego and vanity, and he just lets it go. So many of you might have the subtitle over verse 24. It might say something like Jonathan eating honey or something like that. And that's because, and that may seem like a strange heading to you, but as we get in here to the first verse, in verse 24, it says, the Israelites were in distress that day. Why? Because Saul, in his infinite wisdom, had bound the people under an oath, saying, cursed be anyone who eats food before the evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies. So none of the troops tasted food. Now this is madness, okay? Now, has anyone ever gone for, you go out for a good sporting event, right? You're playing baseball or football, you're going for a run, and you're doing this all day long. And then someone comes along to you and says, by the way, you can't eat. All you're thinking about is, that sweet, man, like, in this case, you see the subtitle about honey. Man, how good would honey be? Like that quick bit of sugar, right? Today we'd probably use like a Gatorade or a Powerade. Just give us that quick pep of energy, that thing to refresh us, and then all of a sudden we feel so much better. But here we have a ruler who says, no, you don't need that. You're just going to keep on going, which seems foolish. Because how on earth do you power your army to keep going if you're not letting them refresh themselves? Right? This is ridiculous. And I also want to, I put emphasis on it when I read it, but I really want to draw your eye to it. These are not God's enemies, although they are. These were Saul's enemies, because Saul's ego has fully taken over at this point. Saul is not interested in standing up for God. Saul's not interested in standing up for his people. Saul is in it for himself. And ultimately, this is going to be Saul's downfall. Right? His selfish ambition is what inevitably will drive him right off a cliff. And so he starts making foolish decision after foolish decision. Good thing we've made it one verse in. Let's get to the next verse, because we got a bunch to go. The entire army then entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. And when they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out. Yet no one put his hand to his mouth, because they feared the oath, of course. But Jonathan had not heard his father, and had bound to the people with the oath. So he reached out with the end of his staff, that was in his hand, dipped it in the honeycomb. Then he raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened, right? He was refreshed. That little bit of pick-me-up that I needed, right? We've been fighting this battle all day. We've been chasing the Philistines for just hours now. I was getting weak and tired, and now, nice little bit of sugar, I'm good to go. Time to keep going. My eyes have brightened. And then, after seeing this, one of the soldiers said to him, your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, cursed be anyone who eats food today, and this is why the men are faint. Right? The army was growing weak. The army was growing tired. And probably the Philistines are able to keep up and keep going. Why? Because they weren't not eating. They were probably running, stopping. Okay, get a drink of water, quick bite of food. Okay, feel good. Let's keep going. But not the Israelites. No. They, terrified of the oath of Saul, were, of course, held to not refreshing themselves. And so instead, they were faint. Jonathan said, my father has made trouble for the country. Right? Not just for the people. He's like, look at what you've done to your people. What have you done, Father? See how my eyes brighten when I taste a little of this honey. How much better would it have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies? Would not the slaughter of the Philistines been even greater? They could have, in one foul swoop, been completely removed of the oppression of the Philistines in this one battle, if only the ego of Saul had not gotten in the way. Do we let our egos get in the way? Because sometimes we do. Sometimes we even tell ourselves, hey, I want to do this because this seems like the right thing. This is the kind of thing that God would want. And maybe it is the kind of thing God would want, right? Did God want Saul to pursue the Philistines? Yes, but the way that he went about it in this silly oath and his own vengeance and his own glory and his own, all this stuff for Saul involved, his heart was wrong, right? You can do the right thing for the wrong reasons. And instead of liberating Israel once and for all from the Philistines, instead they are going to continue to remain a menace because of the foolishness of Saul. See, that day after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Ajalon, they were exhausted. And they pounced on the plunder and taking sheep and cattle and calves. They butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. And if that wasn't clear, then someone said to Saul, "Look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it." Now, most of us are from a rural setting, and we're all fairly familiar with what happens when you hunt. But when you hunt, you kill the animal, and then, after you dress it, you hang it to drain out all of the blood. Why? You don't want to eat that. A lot of bad things can come from eating blood. And it's always amazing to me that before we ever had, science or microscopes or the ability to figure out what germs were, we had this group of people who was being led by God to say, hey, by the way, this is a bad idea. And what is he going to do? Tell them, well, it's because of the bacteria and the viruses that are inside the blood that could possibly lead to your death? It's no, they don't even understand what that is. But we know what that is today, and that's why this is still a thing that we do to this day. We drain the blood out of the animal because it makes it so that it is actually safe to eat and clean to eat. But of course, if you take an army of people and you force them to work super, super hard and they're super famished and they're really, really tired, and then all of a sudden, night fell, now we are free from the oath and we can eat. They ain't waiting because they are famished. So they're just slaughtering and going right to it because they are hungry. And Saul has now caused the inadvertent sinning against the Lord. Right? I don't believe that when he put this oath in place that he intended for the people to begin sinning against God. But this was, of course, an unintended consequence. Right? When he followed his own ego, when he followed his own desires to prop himself up, he caused the people to sin. You have broken faith, he said. Roll a large stone over here at once. And then he said, go out among the men and tell them, each of you bring me your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it. See, when we read this thing, right, you can see, maybe he was still concerned about sinning against God, but I'm not convinced of that, because the behavior that I see from Saul is just someone who thinks he can check the boxes, someone who can do all the things in order to get what he wants from God. This is not a man after God's heart. He's not saying let's not sin against God to be good to God because we love God, because we want to seek out what he desires and do the things of God that are desirable. We're seeing it because he realizes, wait a minute, if I want to finish winning this battle, I better not sin because that's going to cost me victory. Nonetheless, I think he did the right thing, again, for the wrong reason. So everyone brought their ox that night and slaughtered it there, and Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this. Remember, Saul was so unpious, Saul was so uninvolved in the sacrificial system, in the worship of God, that when he met Samuel face to face, he didn't know who he was. Samuel, who was probably the most famous Israelite at the time, right? Because everywhere he went, right, he was the prophet. He was the man. He was the high priest for God. And yet when Saul met him, he had no idea who he was. Saul was not a pious man. He never was. And so here we see him years into his kingship, suddenly, finally, seeming to do something pious. But again, I'm not convinced that he did this for God, but I think he did this for his own good. Why? Because immediately after he sets up this altar, immediately after he brings the people into this, it says in verse 36, Saul said, "Let us go down and pursue the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn, and let us not leave one of them alive." Right? He's interested only in God giving him the strength that he needs to finish off his enemies, because Saul wants to be remembered. Saul wants to have his glory, his legacy. So the people, of course, reply, "Do whatever seems best to you." But the priest said, this may seem strange to us because obviously we don't really travel with armies like this anymore. But of course, the priest would be with the army because they wanted to make sure they stayed in the designs of God. And he said, "Let us inquire of God here." Right? Of course, Saul wasn't interested in inquiring from God. Saul was interested in glory. But of course, the men, for the most part, are people after God. They want to serve God. Remember, we had this big turn of heart that happened only a couple chapters before, where suddenly the people went, "You know what? Yeah, look at all these silly things that we've been doing for so long," and they burned all of their idols, and they turned themselves fully to God. They wanted to go after God's heart. So when the priest says, "Let us inquire of God here," even if Saul challenged this, it wouldn't have gone over well. So instead, Saul asks. He asked God, "Shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand?" But God did not answer. So Saul therefore said, "Come here, all you leaders of the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today." Again, he's looking at this as a checkbox. Now, he happens to be right, but it's still a checkbox. He feels like if we can rid ourselves of this, then good things will come. As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die. Remember, this originally started as "let a curse be on you." Now he's up in the stakes. Now I'm going to kill the one who sinned against the Lord. Do you remember Jephthah not that long ago in the book of Judges, and the foolish oath that he made, the foolish promises he made, to the point where it cost him his daughter? Here we see it again. We see people, even though he was fully aware of the history, he knew the stories of the judges. This was passed down. Saul was not ignorant of this fact, and yet he makes the exact same error. This is important for us to recognize here today, because sometimes we feel like, well, if I know, then I won't make the same mistake. No. You can know and be fully able to make the same mistake, because if your intentions are wrong, then it doesn't matter what your actions are. Again, this was something that God called from the beginning. "I wish that you were just after my heart." Verse 40, Saul then said to all the Israelites, "You stand over there, and I, Jonathan, my son, will stand over here." And they said, "Do what seems best to you," they replied. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel, finally. And he said, "Why have you not answered your servant today? If the fault is on me or my son Jonathan, respond with Urim. But if the men of Israel are at fault, respond with Thummim." So if just in case you're unfamiliar, the high priest of the land, he had this like little bag around his neck, and it had these two stones inside called the Urim and the Thummim. Urim and Thummim. And they use this as we're not 100% sure how exactly, like, did they just reach in and pull out one and that helped? We don't necessarily know how, because sometimes God wouldn't answer. Right? So you would think if there's only two stones, there's going to be an answer every time. But sometimes God wouldn't answer. So we don't necessarily know how that worked, but we know that there was a method to this. And this was one of the ways that they used to divine God's will. And so Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, the men were cleared. So, okay, they got recognized. It's either Jonathan or Saul. So Saul said, "Cast the lot between me and Jonathan, my son." Jonathan was taken. So then Saul looks at Jonathan, said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you have done." And I love this because in a conversation that Jordan and Ethan and I were having yesterday, I remember I made this comment. We finally see some personal responsibility in this entire story. Someone finally owns up and said, "This is what I have done." Jonathan is a legend in my estimation here. Jonathan tells him, "I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die." He doesn't beg. He doesn't plead. He sees what is becoming of his father. He's watching his father go down this path, this dark path that he has been on a journey from, or on a journey to. And we're going to see it as we continue in the book of 1 Samuel. You see it get worse and worse and worse, because if you don't deal with a problem, it just festers and infects and gets worse and worse and worse until you're completely consumed. But Jonathan, on the other hand, in an amazing act of courage, says, "Yes, I did it, and according to the law of the king, I must die." He just owns up. He takes it. He bears his cross. He holds his burden, and he says, "Let no one else suffer but because of me." And so what's Saul say? Saul says, "May God..." He didn't learn, okay? He's already made a bad oath. Then he upped the stakes. And then what's Saul do in verse 44? Saul says, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely." He adds to it, "if you do not die, Jonathan." Here's another great tip that we can learn from this story. Sometimes we need to just shut up, okay? We got to just stop digging that hole. Because man, oh man, sometimes when we get into that hole, we just double down again and again and again. And here we see Saul, he just keeps digging and digging and digging, and he's making it worse and worse for himself. What is he doing? But then immediately after, the men said to Saul, "Wait, and this is going to be a major turning point. Remember what I said at the beginning of the story. Saul was after his enemies, after he was going for his vengeance. This is what Saul was after. And what is it? Should Jonathan die? Jonathan, who has brought about this great deliverance. Jonathan brought the great deliverance in Israel. It was, they say, never, as surely as the Lord lives, not a hair on his head, not a hair on Jonathan's head will fall to the ground. For Jonathan did this today with God's help." Do you guys remember the story? It was Jonathan who sought the Lord first. It was Jonathan who said, "You know what? This is what God has called us to do, and I'm willing to do it no matter how scary, no matter how dangerous." It was Jonathan who kept going after God's heart. And even though Saul was doing this for him, for his glory, for his vengeance, even though we do things sometimes for ourselves, in the end, the people around us, the men in this story, they see the truth. Jonathan is the hero of this story, not Saul. It wasn't the king. It was his son, the man who trusted God. So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. So then Saul stopped pursuing the Philistines, and they withdrew to their own land to ever be a thorn in their side. And after Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side, Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, and the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines wherever he turned. He inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly to defeat the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them. It wasn't all bad. But again, sometimes you can do the right thing for the wrong reasons. See, Saul's sons were Jonathan and Ishvi and Malchishua. The name, man, what a name, Malchishua. The name of his oldest daughter was Merab, and that of the younger was Michal. Michael? Yeah, I would say Michal. His wife's name was Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz. The name of the commander of Saul's army was Abner, son of Ner, and Ner was Saul's uncle. And Saul's father, Kish, and Abner's father were Ner. Fathers Ner were sons of Abel. Man, tongue twister here. And then all the days of Saul, there was a bitter war with the Philistines. And whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took them into his service. What did we learn? Number one, don't make stupid oaths. We see it again. Bible's quite clear on this. In fact, for whatever reason, as people, we're just like inclined to make these stupid oaths. We keep doing, and we think it like adds some sort of virtue that we're saying, this is a principle that I will stand by. Well, why don't we just say, how about instead your only oath be that to the Lord? Instead of making these silly oaths that end up causing our own destruction later on. The other thing that we can see is that ultimately at the end of the story, by doing the right thing, by following the right path, right? Jonathan, remember, Jonathan snuck out from the army. Jonathan went on and did what was right because he knew what was right. He trusted God. He sought God. Remember that. He went to the Lord and said, God, should I do this thing? And God gave them into his hand. It was Jonathan who began the big attack with the army. And doing the right thing. Even if it means your condemnation. Because for those of you who don't know, yet Jonathan is not going to inherit the throne. Right? Even though he's prince right now, he will never be king. But doing right ultimately led to the liberation of the Hebrew people. They were finally free. We just sang a song about being free in God's freedom. That's exactly what the Hebrews finally got. When there were those that were willing to trust God, when Jonathan stepped out and said, I'm willing to do this thing, they finally got that land that was promised. It's going to take them a while. It's going to take until Saul goes away, until the full kingdom is finally realized. But it finally happened because of the faith of those who are willing to trust God. So we need to ask ourselves, are we doing the right thing for the wrong reasons? Are we even doing the right thing? But we need to question our motivations. Because if your motivation is wrong, then it doesn't even matter what it is that you've done. Right? There's a reason why Saul can do some good things and he's looked at as a bad king, and yet David can do so many bad things and is looked at as an amazing king. Because one desired his own ego, wanted to be remembered and have his legacy, and the other wanted nothing but to please God and desired the heart of God, even though he screwed up again and again and again. But his motivation, his intention, his desires, those are the things that God can see. Those are the things that God will judge. Right? How many, what's it say in the book? I believe it's Matthew. Correct me if I'm wrong. In the book of Matthew where it says, people will knock and I'll say, I don't know you. Even though you will cast out demons, you will spread the gospel, you will do these amazing things in my name, and I will say, I don't know you. Why? Because your motivation was wrong. Your heart wasn't after God. This has not changed. I don't care what anyone says. People say, the Old Testament's about following rules and the New Testament's about grace. No, it was always, always, always about grace. The Old Testament is about people trying to follow rules. And the New Testament is the realization that that wasn't going to work. So what path are you going to set yourself on today? Let's take the time to go to a moment of prayer.